CAI para mí es un espacio de los ingenieros para los ingenieros, en donde lo que buscamos es compartir experiencias, tratar de trazar cuál es el futuro de nuestra profesión y también repensarlo.
Lo que me llevó a participar del CAI es la posibilidad de profundizar sobre temas que creo que deberían estar en el arsenal de todos los ingenieros.
Permite desarrollar nuestra actividad en forma intensa y planificada y con visión de largo plazo. CAI es nuestra institución.
Y el CAI para mí es un espacio de los ingenieros para los ingenieros, en donde lo que buscamos es compartir experiencias, tratar de trazar cuál es el futuro de nuestra profesión y también repensarlo.
Lo que me llevó a participar del CAI es la posibilidad de profundizar sobre temas que creo que deberían estar en el arsenal de todos los ingenieros.
Permite desarrollar nuestra actividad en forma intensa y planificada y con visión de largo plazo. CAI es nuestra institución.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Desde el Centro Argentino de Ingenieros les damos la bienvenida a este nuevo evento de nombramiento de socio honorario. En esta oportunidad, quien recibe esta mención otorgada por la Comisión Directiva del CAI es el profesor David Sedlak, a quien le agradecemos muchísimo que haya aceptado esta distinción. Conversará junto con el presidente del Centro Argentino de Ingenieros, el ingeniero Pablo sobre Agua 4.0, cómo podemos repensar el uso del agua y qué oportunidades tenemos en Argentina. Como siempre y como ya saben, esta conversación está siendo transmitida en simultáneo por el canal de YouTube del CAI, donde podrán volver a encontrarla tanto a esta charla como a las demás que se realizan en el Centro Argentino de Ingenieros. Voy a compartir una breve bio del profesor Sedlak para luego dar inicio a la conversación. David Sedlak es el profesor Plato Malozemoff del Departamento de Ingeniería Civil y Medioambiental de la Universidad de Berkeley. Además, es director del Centro de Agua de Berkeley y subdirector del Centro de Investigación en Ingeniería de la NSF para la reinvención de la infraestructura del agua urbana de la nación. La investigación del profesor Sedlak se centra en el desarrollo de enfoques para la obtención de agua sea menos susceptible a un clima cambiante. En la última década, gran parte de esta investigación se ha centrado en la reutilización del agua potable, la práctica de tratar las aguas residuales municipales hasta un punto en el que puedan devolverse al suministro del agua, así como en la captación y el uso de las aguas pluviales urbanas. El profesor Sedlak es miembro de la Academia Nacional de Ingeniería y ha recibido numerosos galardones, entre ellos el Premio Paul Busch a la innovación en la investigación aplicada a la calidad del agua y el Premio Clarke a la excelencia en la investigación sobre el agua. También es autor de Agua 4.0, pasado, el presente y el futuro del recurso más vital del mundo. Con esto le voy a ceder la palabra al ingeniero Pablo, presidente del CAI, para que comience este evento de nombramiento de socio honorario. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos.
Muchas gracias, Verónica. Muy buenos días a todos. Para mí es verdaderamente un honor y un gusto poder llevar adelante este evento. Como todos sabemos, para el Centro Argentino de Ingenieros, esta distinción es una de las más altas que otorgamos, y creo que hoy lo estamos haciendo a un candidato, a David Sedlak, que tiene sobradas razones para que el CAI lo distinga de esa manera. Y me parece además que el tema que él conoce y ha desarrollado tiene verdaderamente mucho que ver con el futuro de nuestras sociedades. Está en el corazón de la sustentabilidad, está también en el corazón, creo yo, del cambio en las nuevas infraestructuras hacia la economía circular. Y además es un tema central en el marco del cambio climático, donde, como todos sabemos, hay una enorme cantidad de desafíos, pero estamos viendo día a día y en cumbres que se van dando. La próxima seguramente será como evento significativo la cumbre de la COP26, pero estamos viendo día a día cómo ese desafío también es una oportunidad, cómo puede ser también un motor de inversión, un motor de participación del sector privado, un motor de innovación. Así que es en ese marco en el cual, como hacemos normalmente en estos actos, vamos a hacer la primera parte, el nombramiento de David, y luego vamos a tener una conversación con él para conocerlo un poco más. Y en este momento pasamos al inglés para comenzar entonces con ese programa. So, I'd like to say hello to everybody. It is for me a real pleasure to be making the opening of this event, and hello to David. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, and thanks for obliging me in speaking in English.
Absolutely. It is a real pleasure, David. So, as we typically do in these kinds of events, there will be an initial part, which is a formal nomination as honorary fellow, and then after that, it comes a very interesting part, which is to know more about you, your ideas, your mind, how you see the future. So let me proceed with the initial part of it. And what we do here is in the past, there were events like this in person, of course, but with this pandemic, we are doing it digitally. So basically, I would like to share with everybody what our bylaws says about this nomination. So for our bylaws, the bylaws of the Argentina Engineering Center, this is the main institution of engineering in Argentina. It is a 126-year-old institution. And in our bylaw, there is a very unique nomination, which is for honorary fellows. And it reads that the Centro Argentino de Ingenieros, the Argentinian Engineering Center, would name honorary fellows, people in science, engineering, and in all kinds of endeavors, which have made themselves public figures and have led significant issues for their country or for the world in different dimensions that can contribute to humanity, to their country, or to the profession. And very importantly, this is a designation that is a lifelong designation without any charge. And also, it is a designation that is appointed by our board, our highest board in our institution, by unanimity and without any presentation from the nominee. So it is for us a very exclusive and unique category. And let me finish this introduction saying that for the Argentina Engineering Center and for myself as a president of our institution, it is a real honor, David, to be naming you honorary fellow of CAI. And also it is for us a message to everybody on the topics and also on the leaderships that we believe are valuable and are significant in order to address some of our main challenges. And at the same time, it is also a way for us to include you in our extended family, so to say. And so we believe that we are going to be benefiting ourselves by your ideas. And also we'd like to tell you that you can count on our institution for any kind of ideas or projects that you may think are valuable. So with this introduction, I want to stress, David, that it is a real honor for us to be naming you honorary fellows. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm quite humbled by the honor and look forward to more interactions with CAI and scientists and engineers in Argentina in the future.
Great. So what we do now, David, is we move into this half an hour or so interaction with you, and we'll be only making some questions so that you can share with us your ideas. So let me start, if you want, by your book, Water 4.0. So this is a book, it's a very comprehensive book that starts at the beginning of civilization, and it is shaping different stages for how humanity has been dealing with water and what may be the future and the challenges. So can you share with us what are the main ideas that you wanted to convey in the book?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I never really set out to be an author of a popular book. I thought if I would ever write a book, it would probably be a textbook for my students or something like that. But as I started working in California on issues related to water scarcity, I found myself interacting a lot more with members of the public and explaining to them some of the ideas and technologies for enhancing water security. And I came to realize that people were thirsty not only for water, but for knowledge about what was happening. And so after giving several big talks to public groups, I realized that there was more there than just a 20-minute talk. There was a whole book there. And so I went on sabbatical and I wrote this book, Water 4.0. And at first I didn't know what the title of the book would be, but after I read it, it became clear to me that the way in which water systems have changed over history in the world is in response to crisis. And every time a big crisis happens, a big idea arises, it becomes the way that there's a consensus the problem should be solved. And that becomes the new version of water. And so the first version of water, or Water 1.0, I give credit to the Romans, but we could look at the Persians or the Chinese, or we could look to Mesoamerican societies and see that when you live in large numbers of people in cities, you need an external supply of water. So the Romans came up with their aqueducts and their distribution systems and fountains. And so we could call that water 1.0. And that's really the way in which most of the world gets its water now. We source water from distant places, we bring it into our cities, and we distribute it around. And when we're done with it, we put it in sewers and we send it out to a river or to the ocean. The second crisis in water happened when the world started to grow and population expanded, and people started to become sick when they were exposed to the waste of upstream communities. And so cholera and typhoid fever was coming from upstream cities, putting their sewage into the water supply of downstream cities. And around the turn of the 20th century, engineers, mainly in North America and Europe, came up with the idea of drinking water treatment plants. And within 20 years or 30 years, a city in a wealthy country wouldn't think about building a water supply without installing either a slow sand filter or chlorinating the water. And that approach of filtering and treating water helped alleviate typhoid fever and cholera in wealthy countries. And so it really was a revolution, and that was water 2.0. The third revolution in water hit in the late 1960s and early 1970s as people became aware of the effects of all of the pollution that was going out into the environment. And it wasn't all coming from wastewater, it was coming from industry, it was coming from agriculture. But the obvious solution, or one way to make a big difference on fish kills and algal growth in rivers and lakes, was to install sewage treatment plants. And so in the US and Japan and Australia and Western Europe, a 20 or 30 year period, all of the cities built sewage treatment plants, and that greatly improved the quality of water. So that was the third revolution. And if you look around the world, maybe in other parts of the world, in Asia or Africa or South America, those revolutions either came slower or they're still in the process of coming, but that's the general progression. And so what I've experienced here in the Southwestern and Western United States has been water 4.0, this fourth revolution in water. And it's a revolution where we go from the linear system of bringing water into cities, using it and disposing of it, maybe treating it and disposing of it, to a circular system where the water that comes into cities is treated and returned to the water supply. So here in California, we're recycling much more of our sewage effluent, or we're capturing the rainwater that falls in our cities and putting it into the water supply instead of putting it into the river. And that idea is becoming this fourth water revolution. Some people refer to it as one water or future water systems. But this is this idea that I think will become more popular and more common around the world in the coming years. And that's what I wrote about in the book.
Well, that is very interesting. And I'd like to ask you if you believe that can be do risk-free, so to say, what may be, even if you think in new pollutants and in very intensive use of chemicals in different industries, including agriculture, how do you see the challenges of this circular economy applied to water?
I mean, there certainly are risks to water supply when you close these loops and start recycling water within a city. But we should also remember that these are the same risks that many of our cities are dealing with today. For example, if you go to Europe and you look at the 20 million people who rely upon the Rhine River as their drinking water supply, in much of the year, the Rhine River, half of it is wastewater effluent, and much of the rest of it is runoff from city streets and farms and factories. And it goes through just a simple conventional treatment system. So when we start recycling sewage, when we start to capture stormwater or use groundwater in our cities, we're doing something that's already quite common around the world. There are many places where the water supply is shared with the upstream city's waste, and only a few of our cities are fortunate enough to have pristine, clean water coming from mountain streams. So that's one piece of it. But the second piece of it is that there are going to be chemicals and during outbreaks, there are going to be pathogens going into the sewer system. and not all of them will be removed by our wastewater treatment plants. So it requires that we are extra vigilant on either how we use chemicals within our cities and how we treat water. And there may be times when we decide that the water isn't clean enough to put back into the water supply, and we let it go. And so there's a need to pay more attention, perhaps, than what we did in the past.
How much of that is we playing God in a way, or in another way of naming it, nature-based design? So using the nature to do part of the work, but in a very highly, so to say, monitored way, including Internet of Things and algorithms and all the kind of technologies that we may be able to use. Do you think that is a part of it? Is it possible to interact with nature and to know more about it and to understand the real dynamics of nature and to use it within, so to say, engineering processes?
Yeah, absolutely, Pablo. You know, really, much of the basis of our water and wastewater treatment processes is natural systems. We're just managing them and intensifying them. So those sand filters I talked about, the slow sand filters, we're relying upon the biofilms and bacteria on the surfaces to degrade contaminants. And this is exactly the way it happens when water naturally infiltrates through the soil, but we're managing it. We're backwashing the filters to restart the process when it clogs to increase the flow. We're choosing the material so that we balance growth of the biofilms versus the rate of percolation of water. And when we move to sewage treatment plants, for example, we're creating systems where those same processes that happen in our rivers are happening in a concrete box. We're adding air, we're handling the surfaces and controlling the microbes. And so now as we move into these circular systems, there is a piece that's going to be highly engineered with reverse osmosis, membranes, or ozonation, and all of these high-tech chemical and physical processes. But there's a piece that is biological, and it's really in some ways biomimetic. And so when we manage a reservoir or send water down a river, we're taking advantage of natural treatment processes, whether it's sedimentation or filtration or photochemical reactions. And these are all part of our treatment systems. And it's interesting that you mentioned the Internet of Things and this idea that we can take it to the next level, because now we have the capacity to monitor in real time flow and water quality and use that to help these nature-based systems be even more efficient. So there's a great potential here in a very inexpensive and simple way of improving water quality. And it's really nothing that's radically different. It's an extension of the technologies that have been developed over the past 150 years.
So let me take you from here to a couple of really big questions. One of them is a relationship between this new approach and energy. So there is a lot of discussion about, for example, hydrogen, and the idea that in the cities we could be generating in a distributed fashion energy using, of course, sun and wind and geothermal maybe. And of course, if you do that with water, with electrolysis, you can do the hydrogen. And then the whole business of managing water in a city may be changing, because now you will be using, it's going to be using a new vector for the energy industry. So this may be only an example, but do you see a new way or even a revolution in the linkage between water and water management and energy?
Oh gosh, there's so many different ways in which water and energy are interlinked. I mean, traditionally, the most obvious one was we used water to cool thermoelectric plants. But as we're moving away from burning things to generate electricity, we're moving to solar and wind and hydrogen. That will free up a lot of water that used to be used for cooling. But there's also, the water energy nexus that people talk about. And I think from the standpoint of water supply, it's the question of intensification of water treatment processes and what this means for electricity demand and greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, we used to think that seawater desalination was a possibly dangerous idea because it consumed so much electricity and generated so much greenhouse gas emissions. But over the last 2 decades, the energy intensity of seawater desalination has dropped by about a factor of 3, and it's approaching the thermodynamic limit. And so to build a modern seawater desalination plant, you're going to be producing water with 3 or 4 kilowatt hours per cubic meter of electricity to push it through the desalination system. That compares to 3 or 4 kilowatt hours per cubic meter in Los Angeles to pump water into the city over the mountain range on the edge of the city. So suddenly, things that seemed that they were too energy intensive start to become attractive because the cost of pumping water over mountains is not going to decrease in the future, but the cost of desalination may continue to drop a little bit more, and it becomes more attractive. And then the other piece of that is that with greater unpredictability about weather patterns, we run into limitations to our ability to generate hydroelectric power. I know in Brazil and in many other parts of the world, in the Western US, hydroelectric is a very important source of electricity. And when you have a drought, you have to choose between generating power and providing water for people. And so it may also change the reliability of those systems, pushing us to look more towards things like solar and wind.
This is very interesting, and we can always compare with Argentina. And in the case of Patagonia, the main cities of Patagonia are on the Atlantic Ocean, and they actually get the water from the Andes, which is very far away. And as we are seeing the Andes running out of water, mainly of snow packages, what we see is that they are facing challenges, and water desalination may be an option for these cities. But of course, it used to be very expensive. Now, if we'll see in the future the cost of energy going down, then maybe some of these issues are going to be less significant as they are right now. So as we can see, and this is also a question for you, many of these analyses now have to be more comprehensive. So we cannot think on very narrow basis on how to fix an issue. We need to understand the big picture, because if you only think on one issue and you don't have into account what may be happening with climate change or what may be happening with energy, then you may be wrong about that. Do you think that is a real thing, that we need to change the way we think about problems? And also in regard to that, do we need to change the way we educate engineers?
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely hit on a very important topic for us as engineers and also as educators, is that we really need to emphasize this kind of systems thinking. And being around civil engineers and environmental engineers, we're frequently thinking in a systems manner, where you have to see all the parts and the changes that occur as you try to implement change. But many other areas of engineering traditionally have been much more focused on solving narrow problems and not showing students how they integrate into the larger piece. And that's becoming very relevant as we think not only about how what we provide as engineers fits into a system, but we think about what society thinks of it. So part of this systems thinking is to recognize that we have to bring decision makers and members of the public along with us. And in a time when information is not always easy to get out to people and facts are often debatable, it's important that we learn to be clear communicators and honestly talk about the risks and benefits of the technologies that we're offering as people are making decisions.
Yes, this is I think is a real need in the way we educate and we so to say think about the big challenges, which when you see now, I think we are in a very exciting time because there are so many new possibilities with technology. But at the same time, if you don't change your mind frame, you may be making wrong decisions. And in particular, the political system may be making wrong decisions because they really don't understand the basis, and they many times don't get a clear idea on what may be the future of some of these trends. And they're only maximizing political outcomes, so to say. So let me take you a little bit to that ground. I have so many topics to ask you. But this is a very important one. I know you are leading a task force, so to say, and this is at the national level, this is the whole US, on how to upgrade the way you manage water in cities, so to say. So can you share with us a little bit what the discussion is about and what may be the agenda?
Well, there are really two efforts that I'm involved in. One was an effort from the U.S. National Science Foundation called Renew It, which stands for Reinventing the Nation's Urban Water Infrastructure. And we've been at that for about 10 years, and the viewers can look at Renew It as the website, RENUWIT. And we've been trying to understand what it takes to get this vision of the fourth revolution in urban water systems to be accepted and invested in more widely in the United States. And while the technical challenges have been exciting and places where our students have done great work and generated many PhD theses and papers, the real contribution, or the strong contribution, comes from thinking about how change occurs and working with social scientists, people in city planning and the legal world and economics to figure out how we change the decision-making process to incorporate some of these more holistic views and to think about what it would take to overcome some of the hesitation. So a good example of that is in this area of potable water recycling, where 15 years ago, water recycling projects were rejected because the public was concerned about the risks and they didn't like the idea of drinking sewage. And you could talk about messaging and making pamphlets and brochures and videos, but really there's a very important contribution from the social scientists to an area called legitimacy, or legitimization. And many technologies, it's not just water recycling, it's everything from nuclear power to commercial aviation to electricity production, goes through a period of legitimization where the public needs to understand that the organizations involved have their best interests at heart and have a level of competency that protects their health. And once you understand that and understand what the ingredients of legitimacy are, you can understand the kind of research that needs to be done and the kinds of institutions that have to be set up to enhance it. And so we've seen in the past 15 years, we've gone from the state where the public was very concerned and the newspapers always wrote articles about toilet to tap projects to a point where no one talks about it anymore. The mayor of Los Angeles goes to the sewage treatment plant and stands over the clarifier and says, in 15 years, there will be no more sewage going to the ocean. It will all be recycled. And no one says anything that this is a bad idea. The legitimacy is there. The second initiative that I'm involved in is something through the U.S. Department of Energy called the National Alliance for Water Innovation. And it's an idea we're just starting now of taking desalination to its next level. And so when you look around the world at the technologies that have increased water security over the past 50 years, probably the dominant one is reverse osmosis. And that idea of the reverse osmosis membrane, a lot of it was born from an effort under the Kennedy administration called the Office of Saline Waters, where President John F. Kennedy, in addition to wanting to take people to the moon, also wanted to desalinate water and invested more money than the U.S. had ever invested before in desalination. And one of those projects led to the first desalination membrane and the first desalination plant. And that technology is spread around the world. And now when you look at Israel or Australia or islands in the Caribbean, people are sourcing almost all of their water with reverse osmosis. And so the question becomes, what is the next level of desalination? And one of the areas, as an example, where we see great potential in the future is inland brackish water desalination. So the desalination of seawater is a relatively mature technology, but there are tremendous reserves of brackish groundwater, that is water that's maybe only 10% as salty as seawater, sitting underneath of our cities, and often in places far away from the ocean. And to desalinate that water, the energy footprint of taking the salts out is relatively low. The real challenge comes from, what do you do with all the salt after you're done? So historically, people have taken the salt and put it back underground, but that's a problem. It's not very sustainable. So if we could find cost-effective ways to manage the salt produced by brackish water desalination, suddenly we open up vast reserves of water that may be useful not only for cities, but for industry and for agriculture. And there are many opportunities like that that we're finding. And the real challenge to us is, what is the fundamental and applied research that's necessary to create those next innovations, and how do you make sure they move quickly out into practice?
That's very interesting. And I want to emphasize the key role of the government in identifying key points and investing. And that is a basis maybe for the private sector to innovate and to adopt new technologies. And you can probably point out to several cases, as you did, where that happens. Now, maybe I'd like to take you to the private sector. So within this broad picture, what do you see the role of the private sector? And let me mention that what we are seeing now, and we will go into California later on before we close, but what we are seeing now is that there are many more institutions and people thinking about pricing water and how to use the market in one way or another in order to allocate resources, and also to, so to say, have signals so that everybody will be improving efficiency and the way they are using water. So my question to you is, in a very broad fashion, what do you see the role of the private sector, both in terms of supply and innovation, and in terms of efficiency and uses of water? And what is your point regarding markets and prices?
Oh, that's a really complex question, and we could talk for a long time. Maybe the first place to start is to say that the private sector has a mixed record when it comes to water, and I don't put so much blame on them as to say that water is not necessarily like other commodities. There's a human right to water that the UN has established, for example. And so water is a little bit special. And I think when we put it into the market, we need to be very careful to make sure that we assure equity of access and fairness. And then on the other side, when the private sector invests in water, they often are frustrated by the political nature of the decision-making process. So the institutions are not always transparent and are not always following pure market economics. And so there's a mixed record in terms of water privatization and bringing private industry into the management of water. And we could look around the world at privatization schemes. Some have succeeded and others have failed. We can look at water trading and water markets. On the other side, I think the private sector, in terms of efficiency, in terms of innovation and ability to invest, has a great deal of potential, especially when we think about government entities, which often are starved for cash and investments. And so unleashing the private sector in the technology area can yield great benefits. But frankly, when we look at investors, they're considering investments in water next to investments in energy and internet technologies and pharmaceuticals. And the water sector is typically not that profitable. And so investors that look to the water sector need to be in it for the long term, because it's hard to make a quick buck in water. And so I think there is like room for the private sector. In fact, there's a compelling need for the private sector, but it's a certain type of private sector involvement. And I think in many cases, it's a little bit more of an enlightened view that this is something that not only benefits the company, but benefits society in the long term. And that kind of complicates things and makes it a little less attractive. So I'm sure we could have a very extended conversation about this, but there are many dimensions to the private sector working in water. They're essential to bringing new technologies to bear. They're potentially problematic in the political process and the equity of access. And they're, when you look at the way the world's going in terms of government investments, they're probably a piece of all of the solutions that we'll have to implement in the future.
Thank you. And now let me take you to California, the beautiful state of California, and even larger than that, the Western US. So what we know is that very recently, for the first time in history, there is an emergency decree or declaration on the Colorado River. By the way, we do have a Colorado River, which is very important for Argentina as well, in the northern Patagonia. And it is also under emergency because of extreme drought. So same things are happening in the northern and southern hemisphere, so to say. But in the case of the Colorado River in the US, this is affecting at least 7 states, including California. And it is the first time in history that it's undergoing an emergency decree. And many people think that this is a turning point. There will be changes, and now things are not going to be the same. There will be rationing of water for several industries, and at the same time, very significant programs for upgrading the way you are handling water. So my question to you is, can you share with us what is the real status of the water issues in California and the Western US? And on top of that, I'd like to know, where do you see the news about it?
This is another topic which we could talk for a long time about, because it's another one of these very complex issues with a long history behind it. But let me start by saying that the threat to California and the Western US from water security is real, but it's often sensationalized in the news. I mean, a picture of an empty reservoir or a field where the trees are dying is always very compelling to put in the newspapers and gets lots of people to click and read. The trend that we're seeing is part of a long-term trend that's been predicted by climate models for decades now of aridification. And so whether it's the cycle of El Nino and La Nina, or whether it's just the higher temperatures leading to lower soil moisture or the disappearance of the snowpack, these are all a confluence of things that come together and reduce the amount of available water resources in the West. And I think that it's a good news, bad news kind of thing, because when you look at the amount of water that's available in California and the West, it's actually a lot of water. We receive a lot of water in the mountains of California, the Sierra Nevada, or in the Rocky Mountains. We've built a tremendous infrastructure for moving that water around. It's just not calibrated to the new normal of less precipitation. And so during the period of the last 70 years, we've been growing crops like cotton and alfalfa, which we feed to cows. And we've been doing the kind of agriculture that is not really very high value. And at the same time, our population of our cities has been growing very quickly. And so you have the city of Phoenix and Las Vegas in the desert area, and you have Los Angeles and San Francisco growing by millions of people. And so we're seeing a realignment that would have taken place even without drought, of more water needs for cities, putting pressure on the system. And so what I expect that we'll see in the coming decades is a shift in our agriculture. For example, in California's San Joaquin Valley, the predictions are that between 10 and 20% less land will be in cultivation in the year 2050 than there is today. But I imagine that a lot of that agriculture will be low value crops. And you'll see that things like almonds and walnuts and pistachios and fruits and wine will continue to be coming out of California and supporting the agricultural economy. So I think that in a lot of places like California in the Western US, agriculture will readjust. And at the same time, our cities will readjust. I think that's why we're seeing this turn towards Water 4.0 and construction of desalination plants to reduce the risk of droughts. The other one, though, that isn't fully appreciated, and then when we talk about this, we tend to talk about agriculture in cities, we can't forget the environment. So the drying of the Western United States has been feeding the forest fires that we've been seeing and has been causing shifts in the ecology of our forests. And that is really a very concerning thing, that as you see warmer temperatures and more drought, you see catastrophic changes in the ecology, and they often have major effects on human health. And so, the last 4 or 5 years here in California, we've had wildfire smoke coming into the cities. And in many ways, it's reversed that great progress we made in fighting air pollution over the last 30 or 40 years. And so there are many new challenges, and not all of them are tied to water supply.
Well, we have been covering many issues, and in order to close our talk, of course, you can feel free to give us any kind of other ideas and message. But let me ask you one last very broad question as well, which is, what do you think about the discussion on abundance? So, as you are probably aware, and this is not only water, but water is a part of it because of scarcity concept. But and it has a lot to do with the base of the pyramid, so to say. A lot of the people that don't have basic services, and also they're very much dependent on water in order to live and to make a welfare somehow. So, but the question is, there is a broad discussion by institutions like, for example, Singularity University, that we are also in a turning point regarding the economy, that the whole idea of scarcity as a whole has taken us here, but it's not the real paradigm in the future because of all this innovation, because of all these engineers. We are engineers that are creating and improving productivity, but also creating new ways of generating value. You yourself right now said that climate change is a big issue, but there is plenty of water yet in California, and it can be managed in different fashions. So my question to you is not only regarding water, but if I have to ask you, are we, or do you think that we are moving into a new paradigm, and the whole way we think about economy is really not appropriate anymore?
That's a great question. I've mused over this a lot, because when you read the way economists see the world's response to climate change, you get a much different view than if you just talk to engineers. So like if you think of William Nordhaus and the Nobel Prize address that he gave a few years ago, the economists predict that our current system will fail to control climate change and lead to temperature increases of as much as 3 degrees centigrade. And the discussion now is about 1.5 degrees change in temperature. And that disconnect is really disturbing, because what it says to me is that the existing system of businesses and governments responding when they encounter a certain amount of stress is not going to solve this problem. And when you think about the underlying causes why the models don't live up to our aspirations, it seems to come down to things like our understanding of the social cost of carbon and discounting for future generations. And so I think that the key to this, in my mind, the key to this discussion about abundance is how much we value the quality of life to future generations, and how much ethically we feel obliged to decrease our aspirations to make sure that the people who come after us have a planet they can live on. And that, to me, doesn't mean giving up on the idea of a better future where everyone is wealthier. It means to me making decisions that are not only based upon becoming more prosperous, but assuring that the next generations are more prosperous. And so I imagine the future is going to be an amazing place with innovation and fewer people living in real poverty. But I think the right place for us to be shooting for is to think about how the actions we take now handicap the future, and maybe planning accordingly and changing the paradigm of growth.
Great. David, thank you so much. It's been a great talk, and we are very happy to have you now at CAI. And of course, there will be a time for you to come here to Buenos Aires. The picture you see behind me is our main building in the downtown area of Buenos Aires. Beautiful building, very old one, and very well preserved. And we would very much like you to be there at one point, and even maybe to offer some kind of a presentation. So let's work on that idea as well. So for us, it's a real honor to include you, to know that we can have a call with you and maybe benefit from your ideas, as I said before, but also count on the institution for any kind of endeavor that you see may be useful in the future. And with this, I'd like to close our event, to thank everybody that's been following this. This is going to be available in our YouTube channel, and many people will see that later on probably. Once again, thank you very much, and we'll be in touch, David.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the honor, and I hope to be able to visit someday.
Thank you.